We now know more and more about Trussonomics, Liz Truss's economic policy. So what is it? Well, first of all, it's all about borrowing, and a lot of it. Now you might think, that's curious. You thought the Conservatives didn't like government borrowing and debt? You might remember things like this.
The Conservative long-term economic plan is working.
So we will continue to be tough on the deficit.
Well, according to Truss, that doesn't matter so much now. Borrowing is fine. In fact, it's a good thing. It's a break with the old orthodoxies. Orthodoxies which, well, awkwardly, the Conservatives made. Now, the government is planning huge spending and borrowing on an energy bailout. It'll probably cost about £150 billion. Enormous. But any government would probably do that and borrow for that at this point, given the energy crisis. But it's the borrowing she'll need to do in addition to that that's interesting to fund her tax cuts.
My first priority is reducing taxes. Well, what I want to do is make sure, first of all, we're reducing taxes.
Because now we're expecting a reversal to the national insurance tax hike of Rishi Sunak, cancellation of increases to corporation tax, a potential stamp duty reduction on home purchases, potential income tax cuts to come, abolition of the banker's bonus tax, and increases in spending on areas like defence as well. And probably more besides. It all costs money. And all this is happening when, because of rising inflation, we're paying more and more interest on our national debt. And it's more expensive for the government to borrow. So it's opened up the opportunity for Labour to move on to Tory terrain.
Liz Truss, the latest graduate from the School of Magic Monetary Economics.
Now, Truss would argue that over the long term, tax cuts can pay for themselves because
That is needed to drive economic growth.
i.e. Truss is saying it doesn't matter if the rich benefit most in tax cuts, partly because, well, they pay more tax to begin with, and ultimately they'll spend more, create more jobs and businesses, and that benefits everyone.
Liz Truss believes that if you cut taxes, even if it benefits those, the richest and big companies more, then their growths will help lift everyone else up.
This sort of reasoning was at its most dominant in the Thatcher-Reagan years, an approach its opponents call trickle-down economics. And on that theme, awkwardly, President Biden tweeted this: "I'm sick and tired of trickle-down economics. It has never worked." Now that was aimed at a domestic audience, not at Truss, but it does show the gap between these two very different politicians. But Truss is right about the diagnosis. We do need better growth and rising wages. The question is whether tax cuts are the way to deliver them, whether everyone will actually benefit, and whether it's right to do it now. Many economists would say that the way to increase growth over the long term is in skills investment, infrastructure, closing economic gaps between regions, all areas where the UK has been weak, and tax cuts are, at best, only part of the solution. And for all of the PM's talk of slaughtering sacred cows and being unpopular, there's one area the new PM won't be touching: Brexit. The government's own estimates show that the economic cost of the now distant economic relationship we have with the EU is significant, probably about £100 billion in lost growth. And we now know the trade deal with the US that was supposed to compensate for that, to be one of the main economic benefits of Brexit.
They still ban haggis, for heaven's sake, in the United States. There are all sorts of opportunities we have to open up trade with the US.
And Liz Truss herself said this week it isn't going to be happening anytime soon. Truss's tax cuts and deregulation is as much then an answer to the failure of trade deals to compensate for lost Brexit-related growth as they are to the wider economic problems we face. So on the pound, on the politics, on the economics, it's all a gamble. But we do know that Truss's government is already very different to what went before.
Now, there is no magic money tree to fund this ever more wishful borrowing and spending.